If you followed news about Latin America on social media, you probably have been, at a certain point at least, an avid user of X or Twitter. But in the last 2 weeks, for us Latin America watchers, something's missing from the platform. Brazilians! Around 22 million of them, to be precise.
Next to South America, an X, formerly known as Twitter, has been banned in Brazil.
O ministro Alexandre de Moraes determinou hoje a suspensão da rede social X.
La sentencia se enmarca dentro de una investigación por la difusión de noticias falsas.
No more come to Brazil messages in your favorite artist feed. No more politicians and newsmakers commenting on political debates and soccer games. Hi, I'm Luisa Leme of ASUA Online. Today, we're going to talk about the shutdown of Elon Musk's platform in Brazil. But we're also going to explain what this incident tells us about internet rights in Latin America.
So I think it's interesting to create like a timeline for this case because it did not start only this last month. So it's a long story about Twitter and the Supreme Court in Brazil. A lot of court orders issued by the Supreme Court, Minister Alexandre de Moraes, and a lot of things happened since 2022.
That's Mahi Santini. She's the founder of NetLab, a research center dedicated to the study of internet and social media platforms in Brazil at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. She spoke with me about the gaps in legislation regulating the internet in Brazil today and how Twitter and other tech companies are responding. On August 30, Brazilian Federal Justice Alexandre de Moraes ordered a ban on Twitter. The shutdown was the finale of a quarrel between Musk and the Supreme Court judge, who's been leading a crusade against online disinformation in Brazil for the last few years.
A senator posted in Twitter pictures of a 5-year-old daughter and the wife of a police officer that was investigating him, for example, with the caption, "Wanted dead or alive." This is the kind of content that Alexandre de Moraes ordered to remove from the Twitter in Brazil, but Musk ignored these requests and refused to comply with the court orders. One example of other examples, ordering removing profiles related to anti-democratic content, January 8 in Brazil, that was like the January 6 in the United States, and saying that this kind of content, for example, can negatively influence the 2024 election in Brazil. We are in the middle of municipal election here now.
After many judicial orders, Musk refused to pay daily fines, closed Twitter's office in Brazil, and refused to name a legal representative in the country.
The minister had no option and blocked X in Brazil. And ironically, the minister posted the notification on the platform saying, "Look, Musk, we are going to block Twitter in Brazil."
X is banned in Brazil until the company decides to comply with the Supreme Court orders. But is this case an aberration or a precedent for the future? Is Latin America advancing new ways to regulate social media? What about big tech?
So Latin America is somewhat of a special region in terms of social media regulation and internet regulation more broadly. And in Latin America, most of the cases that were litigated against platforms, at least, they built off a language of freedom of expression, a regional language of freedom of expression, which is not an absolute right.
My colleague Chase Harrison spoke with Agustina Del Campo, director of the Center for Studies on Freedom of Expression at the University of Palermo in Buenos Aires. She explained how countries and companies are calibrating their approach to citizens' rights on the internet. You will hear more from Del Campo, but first, I talk with Santini about Brazil's pioneer internet legislation and how this Twitter case could mean a new phase in the debate on disinformation and freedom of expression in the region. Thank you for being with us. Don't miss an episode and follow us even on Twitter. Subscribe to Latin America in Focus on your platform of choice. We hope you enjoyed this episode.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
Mahi, thank you so much for participating in Latin American Focus. We really appreciate your participation.
Thank you a lot. Thank you for having me.
Let's start talking about Brazil as an international example when it comes to legislation about the internet. Could you walk me through what in Brazil is called Marco Civil da Internet, the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights? How much of this legislation dictated what happened with Twitter this time?
Yes. So I think the most important is the impact of suspending a platform so important as Twitter and the discussion we need to have about the tension between, on one hand, the concept of freedom of expression, free circulation of ideas, and on the other, the protection of individuals' rights, values that the society really cares about, and people there are at risk of harm, for example. There's a tension between these two ideas, but there is an article, the Article 19 of this legislation of the Brazil's Bills of Rights, that says the internet providers are not responsible for third-party content.
That means that Twitter would not be responsible for what users are posting on the platform?
Exactly. Not only Twitter, but all the platforms. The lawyers of these platforms use this Article 19 saying, look, the Article 19 of the Bills of Rights say that I'm not responsible for users' content, third-party content. So it's not my responsibility. And I cannot suffer penalties because of that. But the interesting thing is that this law conflicts with other Brazilian legislations. For example, we have a legislation to protect consumers that try to guarantee the rights of the consumers. This Consumer Protection Code, I don't know the name exactly in English, emphasizes the consumer protection. On the other hand, Bills of Rights tends to favor the protection of the digital platforms. We have a lot of contradictions, so that's why we are in a very interesting moment in Brazil now because the Supreme Court said that they will vote the constitutionality of this Article 19 to understand if it needs to change the text or to conduct a different interpretation of this Article 19. And the Supreme Court wants to vote these changes this year. So it's expected to happen because in some cases, these articles, as I said, contradicts fundamental principles of human rights, human dignity in the face of the Brazilian Constitution. That's why it's a problem.
A lot of the coverage about this case talks about this, almost personal feud between Elon Musk and Alexandre de Moraes, and it gets a little bit personalized. But you were also talking about criminal activity online, right? Scams, hate speech. Alexandre de Moraes talks about in his decision, right, when in his ruling about how Twitter and technology companies and platforms need to be aware that the content that they are freeing themselves of the responsibilities affecting things like the elections. Does that mean, Mahi, that tech companies are starting to be held accountable for misinformation and crime happening through their platforms in Brazil now?
I would like to say yes, but I need to say no. I think one of the things is that Article 19, because the central problem is the problem of moderation, a problem that indicates that these platforms are or not media companies. And if they are, they need to respect the same rules that media companies respect in Brazil and be responsible as the media companies are in Brazil. So the moderation is the central debate because, for example, the argument of Elon Musk that he's suffering censorship because he needs to moderate users are weak because the platform moderates millions and millions of users every day. For us, problem of moderation is very important because the platforms should assume they moderate and should be transparent, should have transparency and accountability of the moderation. So if they want to moderate users, they need to moderate respecting the law and be transparent about it. Can't be something that I moderate who I want, I do whatever I want, so my platform, my rules. They are not a country, they are only a company.
Can you give us a little bit of an example for this issue, this big difference that you're talking about?
Oh, yes. For example, platforms moderate pornography every day and discussion and conversations about it, photos, videos, but they are not transparent about it. For example, there is a lot of studies in academia showing that 95% of the content they moderate are proactive, are decided by themselves, and 5% are requests from governments. But they only say transparent if they are, normally they are not, about the call for moderation when governments ask for moderation, and never say about why they moderate, how much they moderate, and the criteria they use, and the volume, the quantity of that.
People don't use the internet in other countries like they use it in Brazil or in the US. Lawyers have said, oh, this is going too far. This is blocking the freedom of expressions of many. Can you explain how we can better regulate without falling to this problem of freedom of speech?
Yes, I think what needs to be clear is that we need to focus on two issues: transparency and accountability. So the law that we apply offline needs to be applied online. That's the responsibility that we want. That's the accountability that we want. So first, they need to be transparent. They can't be so opaque. They can't have the power to distribute using their algorithm, controlling what people will see and what people will not see. This is very important. Transparency without saying why they do that and the criteria they use, and in some way to be auditable as other sectors of the economy are, as other companies are in Brazil. So it's the first thing. And the other, to be responsible as all companies that operates in the country are. So I don't think we should have in this bill criteria of what is disinformation, what is not disinformation, what should be moderate, what should not. That's not the case. I think maybe a regulatory agency or maybe the traditional judiciary will decide the specific situations. But the person or the company that feels that they were damaged by something, they have the right to ask the justice to decide if a content needs to be moderated or not. They are very slowly in the country. So you can suffer for something for a decade to then, after 10 years or 20 years, moderate the content. It does not make sense. So we need something faster that protect consumers, protect society, protect our children, and some baselines, some principles that these platforms need to respect. And if they do not, of course, they will be responsible for that. They will pay for that. The Article 19 say they do not need to pay for that.
Okay, so we will see what's going to happen with this review of this article by the Supreme Court. The European Union just passed a law based on artificial intelligence to regulate it. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the legislation plans for this issue?
Yes, the Bill of Fake News, nickname of the legislation, was very interesting. The text were very close to the DSA that were approved in Europe, the DSA and DMA. But the platforms, they articulated to kill this bill. And now there is a movement, a very interesting movement, that these platforms are negotiating and articulating with the parliamentarians, the congressmen, to write a bill that are in favor of them. to say that they approved something in Brazil to stop depression, but the text will be a text that is very pro-platform. So I think it's the most dangerous thing that is happening in Brazil, and maybe it's happening in other countries in Latin America. But Brazil, I think it's the place where a lot of things are being tested. Not only the block of X, but this lobby of the big techs to approve a legislation that benefit them. That will be very interesting, because if it's successful, maybe they will try to apply this in other countries.
How do you see the Brazilian case comparing with others?
I think that Brazil last year trying to approve this bill of transparency and accountability for the big techs suffered something completely new comparing to other countries, because these platforms, they behave in a way that shocked the world. They started to make, for example, ads on their own platforms and other platforms using all their economic power to influence the public opinion against this bill. The news we have is that this bill is dead. So considering this, that were a scandal, a world scandal, I think this year Brazil is trying to respond to this situation in a very new way, just blocking a platform like Twitter and saying the world, look, okay, we like the platform, everybody use that, but there's a limit. You need to respect our democracy, you need to respect the local laws, you need to respect the population. And it's very strange, the position of Elon Musk supporting the far right. So there is a lot of situations that we as a country, we don't want that. And I think the majority of the population are supporting the minister, Alexandre de Moraes. The monitor we do on digital platforms conversation, population is supporting. Especially because Twitter was a platform very important for the press, the media outlets, and celebrities. And all the press are supporting this decision, recognizing that it's an absurd to do what Elon Musk does in the country.
It's been now, I think, 2 weeks that Brazilians can't access Twitter. There are memes online talking about how people are having withdrawal crisis from Twitter. And how do you see these elections unfolding without Twitter? Do you feel it's going to be different?
No, I don't think so. I think the Twitter is used in Brazil by elite, and especially for the media outlets and people that really are really addicted to news. But these people, normally they use a lot of platforms at the same time. They have a lot of sources. So I don't think it will make a difference for the population, because Twitter in Brazil have only 22 millions of users, but we have a population of 2010 millions of people. So I think maybe we are experimenting the situation of, if a platform is closed, we go to another one. And people are trying to use, for example, Blue Sky, and using more other platforms like Instagram and Facebook. And I think the other companies, they are very happy with that, because the Supreme Court just closed the competitor. So I think we should consume news and produce news, not depending so much on a platform like Twitter. So it's been a very good experiment for we that work on the communication sector.
That's great. A healthy exercise. Marie, thank you so much for your time and for explaining so much, and for us in such a complex subject.
Thank you a lot. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure for me.
What does this Twitter case mean for the rest of the region? And how does Latin America fit into a global juncture of internet and social media regulation? Chase Harrison talks with Agustina Del Campo now.
Agustina, welcome to the Latin America in Focus podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We just saw this particularly high-profile spat between a justice on Brazil's Supreme Court and Elon Musk, who owns Twitter or X. But I want to zoom out a little bit beyond just this incident to understand better the landscape of social media regulation across Latin America. I know it's a big region, but how would you generally categorize the strength of regulation?
So Latin America is somewhat of a special region in terms of social media regulation and internet regulation more broadly. Europe has their e-commerce directive in place, and it has had it for a really long time. And the US, it's Section 230. Latin America played around for over a decade with different bills in different countries to adopt a standard, particularly on intermediary liability. But for the most part, except Brazil, which has its Marco Civil, every other country in the region failed to adopt a general, broad legislative standard. So instead, what has happened in the region was that we had a number of really interesting cases that were brought to lower tribunals, and it took a really long time for them to get to the Supreme Courts and constitutional courts in the region, but eventually they did. And there's a jurisprudence that has been forming and developing for the last 15 years that shaped the landscape of intermediary liability. That's the liability of any intermediary service. So it applies to any internet service. So it's a region where there are no broad intermediary liability laws in place. And therefore, courts have had a very active role in shaping the standards.
So you just noted that Brazil was the only country that passed this legislation. How has social media been regulated in Brazil because of that legislation, as opposed to what exists in other countries? Is a social media user in Brazil seeing a different feed than, say, someone in Argentina or Costa Rica?
No, I don't think so. I think the only difference was that Marco Civil formally picked up a standard that is in place in most of the region. So most of the region developed a standard of intermediary liability where companies are not responsible for third-party posted content. In the case of Brazil, because they have Marco Civil, they have a formal law in place that says so. In the rest of the region, the standard was developed mostly based from freedom of expression laws, which is really interesting because it's not a standard that was developed from that point of view in other places. It was mostly from a commercial point of view and not a human rights point of view.
And how does that different point of view inform the approach to regulation? What does a free speech-based approach to these platforms look like?
Well, what we've seen in countries like Colombia, Argentina, even Mexico, Chile, is jurisprudence that builds off the traditional freedom of expression standards. In building off those standards, the way they are framed is somewhat different than the way the European standard is built or the way the US standard is built. For one, the role of inter-American human rights standards in the region has been very highlighted. The link between freedom of expression and the regulation of social media, but of the internet more broadly, is a very profound link in Latin America, which is somewhat different in other jurisdictions.
Elon Musk speaks a lot about the importance of freedom of expression. He says he's a free speech absolutist. So have companies like X, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, have they been receptive and cooperative to this free speech human rights approach that you just spoke about?
For the most part, yes. I mean, if you take a look at the last 15 years, the positions of companies vis-a-vis human rights have changed dramatically. If you look at how freedom of expression moved as a core value of these platforms in this 15 years. It's also been interesting. For a decade or over a decade, until the pandemic, I would say most platforms and most social media would be very direct sponsors of freedom of expression globally. Then the pandemic hit, and you have a change, a shift in attitude. Ironically, Twitter was, I think, the first company that changed the language. They used to speak about speaking truth to power, and they started talking about a healthy conversation instead of speaking truth to power. And that happened somewhat before the pandemic. And then with the pandemic, you saw a couple of different platforms adopting the language of a healthy conversation that turned more around trust and safety than freedom of expression. And in Latin America, most of the cases that were litigated against platforms, at least, they built off a language of freedom of expression, a regional language of freedom of expression, which is not an absolute right.
One type of regulation we've seen in the region that relates to this concept of not absolute freedom of speech is we've seen social media companies take down accounts. We saw it in Venezuela and Mexico, and it was sort of the center of what the dispute was in Brazil, how much governments or social media companies have the right to deplatform people. Have these examples of the removal of accounts off social media platforms changed the way that governments or social media companies are approaching their platforms?
We've seen very few. I mean, it really depends on how you define deplatforming. But I think we did see a lot of controversy, again, during the pandemic particularly. Whose health authority was an authority for health-related information, for example. When social media companies were asked to promote sort of official information, where is the official coming from? Is it coming from the health ministry of Brazil, or is it coming from the health ministry of the US, or is it coming from the World Health Organization, or who's the authority? And what happens when authorities have conflicting views on different things? And I think that sparked interesting debates. To be quite honest, I haven't seen a legal impact of that in the region. I haven't really seen bills popping up to fight this kind of phenomenon. I do think that those episodes fuel this very unsettling nationalism kind of sensation that can be really problematic. Going back to what's happening in Brazil, one of the things that is concerning to me is how this is quickly turning into a sovereignty kind of issue, and how it's, well, we need to defend our values and we need to defend our laws. In that rhetoric, there's a lot of emotion that paints a little bit the legal arguments that are behind. It creates a muddy kind of scenario for a strictly legal conversation.
So looking forward, is what happened with X in Brazil going to change the conversation across Latin America with social media regulation? I mean, is this muddy conversation going to become regional, or do you think that this was a very isolated incident?
I think Brazil is very exceptional in many ways. The legislation that Brazil has, but also its jurisprudence, is not quite aligned, and it's not quite modelized for the region. So when you look at legal developments in the region, you can see trends going from Spanish-speaking Latin American countries and trends that are strictly Brazilian. In that sense, I think it's difficult to assess whether this particular episode will have an impact. I think politically, it obviously will have an impact, and you have already seen that. Maduro has already said that Musk is the archenemy of the state. You've seen similar declarations from Pedro, yeah, and they are popping up. Whether that political conversation will turn into a regulatory conversation in the region, I think it's left to see. The other thing that I would add is that Brazil's conversation over platform regulation is not isolated. It's a conversation that is happening in a context. Europe has adopted a new paradigm for regulating social media. They have adopted the DSA, the Digital Services Act. They are actively promoting that law as a desirable global standard for platform accountability. You can see some empowerment of Brazilian policymakers sort of taking some of the language from the DSA, taking some of the language from UNESCO's guidelines to regulate social media, which sort of mirror the DSA. So it's a context. I think it's left to see. I think the impacts are easily identified in the political conversation. I'm not sure if in the regulatory landscape they will have the same effect.
Augustina, thank you so much for coming on the Latin America in Focus podcast.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for the interesting conversation.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Leme, sitting in for Karin Zissis, who will be out for the next months. This episode was produced by our associate producer, Fabrício Ricalde. I'm executive producer for the show. The music in this episode was Caiboaté, performed by Alejandro Brittes, and his Baroque Ensemble for America Society. You can catch this performance and others on our YouTube channel. Find out about upcoming concerts at musicoftheamericas.org. You can access other episodes of Latin America in Focus at www.as-coa.org/podcast. We have 200 of them for you. And send us feedback at latamfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you get your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more, visit as-coa.org.